Las Vegas, Nevada is known as the ultimate playground for adults, full of casinos, nightlife, and world-renowned stage acts. But it's also a city that became synonymous with corruption, intrigue, and vice. In 1971, the death of one of its most famous residents sparked a controversial investigation that would leave everyone wondering what really happened. The Las Vegas Strip is one of the most iconic and recognizable locations in America, lined with storied hotels and casinos. In recent years, Vegas has attempted to shed its image of debauchery for something more family-friendly. But during the 1960s, it was a hotspot for entertainers, athletes, and the mafia, earning it the nickname Sin City.
Vegas is really beginning to find its footing as a little bit of a boom town in the 60s and moving into the 1970s.
Las Vegas was the hub of everything. It was the biggest night spot, entertainment spot in the world. And you wanted to gamble, and you wanted to see great shows and great entertainment. You went to Las Vegas.
After gambling became legal in 1931, mobster Bugsy Siegel saw an opportunity to invest. He opened the Flamingo Casino and Hotel in 1946, and the mob soon took over.
It was definitely a mob town. It was their playground. And that's why they got all these great entertainers, because they control almost all the nightclubs in the country. They could afford to pay these nightclub entertainers what you would pay a movie star, because they had not only the ticket sales, but the subsidy from casino gambling.
This was the perfect setting to see them running portions of the boxing industry.
Boxing was very lucrative, first of all. That's one of the reasons why the mob gets involved. But secondly, I think that just maybe boxers are attracted by mob guys, and mob guys are attracted by fighters.
Up until the 60s, Madison Square Garden was the main stage for professional boxing. But it would find a new home 2,500 miles away in the desert of Nevada.
Some of the casinos put up money to host this heavyweight championship fight in Las Vegas in 1963, the first title fight ever held in Las Vegas.
For a city built on gambling, boxing was a perfect match. The casinos soon took control, inventing the phenomenon of big-budget title fights. And in December of 1969, there was a lot of money riding on the highly anticipated comeback match for ex-heavyweight champion Sonny Liston.
Sonny Liston was considered the Mike Tyson of the 1960s.
Sonny Liston is my idol as a fighter. He had to beat all the best contenders to get the people to take him seriously, to accept him.
Only 2 minutes and 22 seconds have elapsed.
He did it on effort alone. December of 69, takes a fight with Leotis Martin here in Las Vegas. About that, everybody thinks he's going to win.
But no one could have predicted that it would be the beginning of the end of Liston's complicated and tumultuous life story. On January 5th, 1971, Sonny's wife Geraldine and son Daniel returned home to Las Vegas from Christmas vacation with her family.
She actually planned to stay longer, but she became concerned after Sonny stopped answering her phone calls. As soon as Geraldine stepped inside the home, she smelled a rotting smell and thought maybe she had left something in the kitchen. But when she stepped into the bedroom, she discovered Sonny's decomposing body.
It was obvious he was dead. She called the sheriff's department, and the sheriff's department called homicide. When I got to the scene, Geraldine Liston had already left the scene, because I guess she was quite traumatized.
38-year-old Sonny had always been a mountain of a man, with enough power to shatter his opponents. So, what could have happened?
We knew he was past his prime. but he was a relatively, young guy. And it was a shock. It was unbelievable that this could have happened.
He was laying in bed. It was a real pretty bad odor. It was really disturbing because he was one of my heroes as a kid. I'll never forget that.
Charles Sonny Liston was born to a family of sharecroppers on a cotton plantation in Arkansas during the Great Depression. Since the state did not require birth certificates, the exact date of his birth became the first of many mysteries that defined his life.
There is some question about his actual birth date, whether it was 1932 or a couple years before. But either way, we know that Sonny Liston was born essentially during the Great Depression. Liston is born in tragedy. I mean, from the beginning, born to a large tenant farming family in rural Arkansas. I mean, the likelihood that which you're able to meet your full potential, the odds are just so far against it.
In 1946, a hard winter left the family struggling to get by. But when his mother left to find work in St. Louis, Sonny ran away from home to follow her.
The father beat him every day. Sonny was the biggest child. He would get the most beatings. There were scars on his face. There were scars on his arm. And of course, he left the father because this was like a childhood from Dickens or Dostoevsky, where there were beatings and hard work.
Once reunited with his mother in St. Louis, Sonny adapted to life on the streets to make ends meet.
He still has no formal education, right? So how do you even translate that success into something that is lasting if you would deny what you need to be successful in other ways because you were born black and poor?
Unfortunately, he assimilated himself into a world of petty criminals.
Over the next 6 years, Sonny was involved in various muggings and robberies.
You live by the sword and you die by the sword. And in them days, there was a lot of tough guys out there, and you get yourself in trouble real easy.
24 arrests in St. Louis, and then he catches a big case. Arrested for essentially strong-arm robbery. And he gets sent to state penitentiary.
While behind bars, 20-year-old Sonny finally discovered his true calling.
There was this notion that the way to rehabilitate young men was through boxing, through this sort of physical competition, exert yourself, right? And that this is the way to teach discipline. And Liston thrives. Liston's involvement with boxing while he's in prison creates for him, for the first time in his life, real opportunities for upward mobility.
He had these great attributes that were there for boxing. He was about 6'1", which is big for the time, but his hands, his fists, which you make your living with in boxing, were disproportionately large. He had an extremely long reach to go along with his physical size. And he had a killer instinct, second to none, and a natural punch.
It wasn't long until the mob came calling. After 2 years in prison, the mob heard about Liston and pulled some strings to get him paroled early.
When he comes out, he assimilates into the mob and the gangster world.
Under control of the mob, he quickly rose through the amateur ranks, winning his first Golden Gloves title in 1952.
He was a brute, a great jab, maybe the greatest of all time. Liston was the ultimate intimidator. He would take his robe off and was heavily muscled, and he could punch. He could punch hard.
He could knock you out with a jab. Foreign guys, they would have had to pay them extra to get in the ring with him because he would just hammer them. You went in with Liston, you put your life in your hands.
They thought that, and I thought also, that I could beat Sonny Liston. I wound up with 71 stitches, a broken nose, and broken left cheekbone.
Sonny was unstoppable in the ring. But when he wasn't boxing, he couldn't stay out of trouble. Less than 4 years after being paroled from prison, he was arrested for fighting with an officer over a parking ticket.
Police officer comes up, begins to harass him, and it escalates.
Liston ended up breaking the leg of a policeman. It was, a felony. Sonny was going away.
Sonny spent the next 9 months in jail. After his release in 1957, he decided to change his life and married his girlfriend, Geraldine Chambers, in St. Louis.
Geraldine offered this positive force. She offers a degree of comfort constantly, this degree of love that is really kind of an anchor for him.
With Geraldine by his side, Sonny continued to succeed in the boxing world.
Just rolled through his division like a gargantuan steamroller. Every single contender in front of me just blew out of it.
By 1962, Sonny had earned the right to face heavyweight champion Floyd Patterson. The fight lasted only 2.5 minutes. But no matter how well Sonny performed in the ring, boxing fans hated him for his ties to crime.
And he was the champion that nobody wanted.
I remember my boss came up and said, "Well, I still don't like him because he had come out of prison." He had everybody rooting against him.
He never could quite get anybody else to see what he had accomplished. That's the tragedy of his life.
So I think there's something in Liston that just says to hell with it. No matter what, he can't please the public. He remains a pariah no matter what happens with him.
In 1964, Sonny faced a new challenger, a hero of the Rome Olympics named Cassius Clay. The two would fight twice that year, and both bouts were controversial.
I thought Liston was going to beat him. I thought Liston hit too hard.
In their first match, Sonny was accused of cheating, but Clay still managed to win. The rematch took place 9 months later. By then, Clay had changed his name and his image.
He goes into the rematch, claims now Muhammad Ali, with a group that is perceived as a racist group.
The Nation of Islam, there begins to be a little bit of a turn in terms of the appreciation of Liston. People who were like, wait a minute, maybe Liston ain't that bad after all.
But this time, the outcome would be even more shocking.
He knew the only way he could beat Ali would be to knock him out, and the only time he could do that was early. So he chased him, and he threw jabs to set up the right hand, and he missed him. He's off balance. Ali brings the hand down and chops.
Liston goes down with what people would call a phantom punch.
Most people thought he was throwing the fight.
The punch and the fight would live on in infamy and cement the public's negative opinion of Sonny.
Liston completely repulsed everybody. My God, this guy didn't just lose, he quit, or he laid down, or he took a dive. But I think the die was cast for his future in Las Vegas.
In 1969, Sonny would move to Vegas and attempt to make a comeback. But less than a year later, he is found dead, and no one can understand why.
I was in shock. Who killed this guy? Who knows?
Las Vegas in the 1960s was a wild and unruly place, full of conmen and career criminals. But the city also suffered from a deep racial divide.
African Americans were not allowed to go on the Las Vegas Strip unless you worked one of the jobs in the back of the house. They would enter those buildings through the back. Sammy Davis Jr. would enter through the kitchen. Pearl Bailey would enter through the kitchen to get to the stage.
And the police were not friendly at all with African Americans.
This town was segregated. I had never seen true racism till I came out here.
So the black community living on the west side built their own version of the Strip along Jackson Avenue.
It was vibrant. The whole area was very alive.
It was in these nightclubs that Sonny Liston felt most at home.
For Liston, Vegas works because in Vegas, Liston fits in. He fits in many different ways, whether it's on the strip with the celebrities or within, in the sort of corner bar. He's able to really live his multiple lives in this one city at that one time.
Sonny no longer held the title belt, but he was still their champion. So, when he's found dead at his home in Paradise Palms, nobody wants to accept it. Instead, they want answers. Investigators find Sonny's body slumped on the bed, with a broken footstool nearby.
He'd been dead 4 or 5 days. He was all bloated. He was laying back. His feet were like on the floor.
How he exactly died is unclear because his body was so decomposed they couldn't determine the cause of death. The police thought maybe he had fallen, which would explain the broken stool. But the coroner learned through the autopsy that he didn't have any head trauma.
His wife, Geraldine, believes he's been killed, but police find no indications of forced entry or foul play. However, they do find evidence downstairs that suggests a different cause of death.
I was talking to the detective, and they said they found a balloon of heroin on the kitchen counter.
So it appears that he had died from a drug overdose.
The theory seems to be confirmed when autopsy reveals a needle mark on Sonny's arm. However, those close to the former champion insist he wasn't an addict.
He hated needles, and so it would be a surprise that he would die from a needle injection. I think what raises the suspicions is that Liston was not known as a heroin user. That raises real red flags.
But as investigators dig further, they discover Sonny had been leading a double life.
He was known to have been dealing at that time.
Liston had known associations with pretty serious narcotics traffickers.
Sonny Liston was influenced by the mob early in his career. Very tough people, and it's tough to get away from people like that, and it was especially tough in them days.
It's unclear how long Sonny had been involved with drugs, but it seems to have spiraled out of control in 1969 as his boxing career slips away. After a hard loss in December of 1969, Sonny lands what would be his final fight against legendary Chuck Wepner.
We had 9,000 people in the Jersey City Army, which was the biggest crowd for any fight in history. He was punching from the opening bell. The referee came in at the end of the 9th round and wanted to stop the fight, and I asked him to let it go one more round. I said, just one more round. I wanted to finish, to kick Sonny Liston's butt and beat him up, and it just didn't happen.
The win earned Sonny only $13,000.
Liston tries to mount a little bit of a comeback. So he's earning a little bit there, but he has to make money in other ways. And it appears that he was doing work, collections, enforcement for people who had organized crime connections. And eventually, it appears that he was doing a little drug trafficking himself.
Liston knew the mob well enough. He was involved in a day-to-day, relationship with them.
Sonny Liston was known as the leg breaker for the mob out in Las Vegas. And it was a fact. He was a money collector.
He's no longer just simply dabbling. He's actually operating and moving in their circles.
But a recent run-in with the law suggests Sonny may have been working both sides of the street, which could have landed him on the mob's hit list.
They had a search warrant for this house. There was 3 people there, and it was Earl Cage, whoever the other guy was, and Sonny Liston. My lieutenant went to Sonny and says, look, we're all friends here, and he took Sonny out of the room. They hauled the other two to jail. Sonny got to go home. Well, automatically, they thinking he was an informant or something because Sonny was given a pass.
However, despite growing evidence that Sonny had quite a few deadly enemies, Las Vegas police suddenly closed the case.
The coroner's report showed that there were only trace amounts of morphine in his system, but it wasn't enough to kill him. So they ruled it that it couldn't have been an overdose or homicide.
The coroner attributes Sonny's death to natural causes. But to Sonny's loved ones, his death is anything but natural.
How many heavyweight champions die in this manner? But then, also because of the connections, right, with the criminal underworld, which just beg for speculation in terms of foul play.
With Sonny Liston, so always what happened?
The mafia's involvement in boxing started in the 1940s. Attracted by its money-making potential, Frankie Carbo, a killer for the Lucchese crime family, began to take control of the sport by managing the careers of young fighters with potential.
For a good part of boxing history, boxers have had their careers managed by individuals from the world of organized crime. Oftentimes, these boxers had no other choice but to associate themselves with these underworld figures. If they wanted to pursue a career in their sport of choice, there was often no other avenue to try to become a successful boxer. Sonny Liston was one of the best examples of this, and some people think that that relationship is what ultimately led to his death.
On January 9th, 1971, a funeral is held for Sonny Liston at the Palm Mortuary. It's attended by an overflow crowd, including casino owners, card dealers, showgirls, and mobsters.
From birth to death, there was never a road for redemption for Liston, just a road for perdition. It is truly an American tragedy.
Sonny's loved ones are convinced of only two things. He didn't die of natural causes, and he didn't inject himself with heroin.
Sonny was deathly afraid of needles, and they discovered a needle mark on his arm. And those that knew him well suspected that if there was a needle mark, somebody else was behind it.
It seems possible that Liston's drug connections got him killed, but others believe it happened on the orders of a much more powerful enemy.
There was a big casino operative named Ash Resnick who came out of New York originally. He was a mainstream gambling. Resnick's name has been thrown around as being involved in his death.
Ash Resnick is sort of the organized crime connection for Sonny Liston in Las Vegas. Resnick is the one that sort of sets him up in that nice house. Resnick is also the one doing what organized crime does, right? Fixing fights.
Days before Sonny's death, he and Resnick were seen having two public arguments, one at the Stardust nightclub and the other at the Thunderbird Casino.
Witnesses at the time described these incidents as violent. Nobody knew for sure exactly what they were fighting about, but they definitely had ideas.
They did have a falling out. I heard stories, but never anything I believed.
Is it possible that Sonny Liston ran afoul of Resnick and Resnick, said, nope, this is not gonna fly, we're gonna do something? Absolutely.
Over the years, Sonny and Ash had made a lot of money from boxing, but some questioned exactly how they made it.
You have the criminal element. Yes, you have somebody who's known for participating in fixing fights. Yes, you have somebody who's dabbling in that world to make money.
A recent fight against boxer Chuck Wepner may have sealed Sonny's fate.
Some say he was supposed to throw the fight with Chuck Wepner, but just couldn't do it. The theory was that Ash Resnick and a lot of other mobsters had lost a lot of money betting on that fight.
I wish somebody had told me that. Maybe I should have said to him, "Hey, Sonny, what are you doing? You were supposed to have thrown this fight." I never heard that story.
Resnick had also been the promoter for both of Sonny's controversial matches with Muhammad Ali. As Sonny's manager, Resnick claimed he lost a lot of money, but it was later discovered that he'd actually made millions.
There's some speculation that Sonny Liston in the second fight takes a dive at the behest of the Nation of Islam, for whom Muhammad Ali was now firmly entrenched. Ali could retain this title in exchange for a percentage of Muhammad Ali's earnings going forward. And that, sort of later on in life, Sonny had begun to talk a little bit too publicly about the fact that he had a percentage of Ali.
The outcome of the first Ali-Liston fight was controversial, but the second is considered one of the most suspicious in boxing history.
Clearly, you look at the tape, he gets hit, but the question is, does he get hit hard enough, to warrant being sprawled out on the ring mat like he was?
For me, the big question wasn't why he went down. What might intrigue me is, why isn't he getting up? And what makes it worse, Ali won't go to a neutral corner because he's standing over him and Ali knows what's going to happen. He says, "Get up, sucker." They'll say it's fake. "Get up, get up, get up." And Sonny, I'm not getting up.
However, many in the boxing world say it's unlikely.
There's stories that the Muslims threatened him, that the mob threatened him, that he made big bets on himself, that everything happened. But why? Why would he do that when the only identity he had, the only segue into real society, to something, was to be the heavyweight champ of the world?
I mean, you got to do a lot of back bending and twisting. It's just too many layers. Too many people need to be involved for that, I think, to really carry any weight in terms of a plausible motivation for Liston to be killed.
But organized crime and shady boxing deals aren't the only possibilities. And as other facets of Sonny's life begin to emerge, so do additional conspiracies.
Sonny had an affair going. Women were like grains of sand. He was womanizing. Sonny had a mistress over there that could have set him up to be killed.
Las Vegas has always had its share of crime. Considering its connection to gambling and vice, it's hardly surprising. But the death of Sonny Liston hit everyone hard, and everyone seems to have a theory about what or who killed him.
Since there was really no homicide investigation, there was really no closure to the case. And this caused a lot of rumors and speculation.
Some of the speculation even involves his wife, Geraldine.
Being married to Sonny could not have been easy.
He was a womanizer. And this town in those days, if you were anybody, the women were like grains of sand.
This is a guy, the kind of women he would have been getting. I mean, he can get any woman he wants. This is a world that was inconceivable to this kid growing up in a backwater in Arkansas. I don't think there was a week went by that he was sexually faithful to Geraldine. She, of course, knew it. You cannot not know it.
Sonny's philandering was bad enough, but Geraldine had a constant reminder of his infidelity living in her house. It turns out their adopted son, Daniel, was actually the product of one of Sonny's flings.
Sonny had a thing with a cocktail waitress, good-looking, busty blonde. One day, him and Geraldine were sitting in a restaurant. She come walking up with this young kid and said, "Here, this is your kid," and handed it to Sonny and walked off.
To prevent a scandal, Geraldine agreed to raise the child, keeping the real story out of the papers. Through the years, she continued to stand by Sonny, but everyone has a breaking point.
My God, did she finally reach her end and say, I can't take it, to the point where she's so fed up that she now arranged for him to get a heroin overdose?
It's not hard to imagine for Geraldine to have built up that kind of animosity towards her husband. And then you take into consideration the things that Geraldine did after she discovered the body.
While Geraldine was never considered a suspect, some find her actions the night she found his body to be suspicious.
When his wife comes home and finds his body, finds him dead and literally decaying, that she doesn't immediately pick up the phone and call the police, but instead, goes to a friend, neighbor's house, and they come back and they spend several hours actually sort of cleaning up the place.
That's just not the kind of thing that you expect a family member to do when they find their loved one dead. Not unless there's something that they didn't want the police to find.
However, others believe there is a more innocent explanation.
It would be very surprising if his wife, Geraldine, didn't know of his involvement in the criminal underworld. So there would have been things around the house that would have pointed to that. So I don't think it was just simply a matter of sort of cleaning up a crime scene to mask something that she may have been involved with. So that's a possibility, that all she was simply doing was trying to clean up a space to protect the name and legacy of her husband.
That woman loved this man. She accepted his child from another woman. She knew what he was doing. I would have ruled her out immediately.
Perhaps Geraldine simply didn't talk to the police because she had a reason not to trust them.
The police had been harassing Sonny for as long as Geraldine and Sonny were together. And I'm sure she knew that those drugs were not there before she got there.
They said they found a balloon of heroin on the kitchen counter. And in the same breath, they told me that Geraldine had to clean the house up for 3 hours. How did she miss the heroin? I felt that somebody from the sheriff's office brought that heroin in to get a search warrant so they could look for more drugs than the cash in the house. That's bothered me for, 50 years.
No one knows what police might have been looking for. But the official explanation for Sonny's death would stand unchallenged for the next 10 years, until a witness steps forward with an astonishing new story.
If you're a contract killer, the first person you need to kill after you kill the target and you've been paid is the guy that hired you.
During the 1960s, Las Vegas police were notorious for using extreme methods in their attempts to keep the peace.
They get rid of undesirables mostly by beating them up and dropping them on the other side of state lines. That could be a vagrant, homeless, criminals. That was considered cleaning up the streets. It was a different time, and they truly had a different way of doing things. And it definitely didn't earn them any friends amongst the Black community. And some consider the handling of Sonny's death as very suspicious.
In the years following the death of ex-heavyweight champion Sonny Liston, the residents of Las Vegas continued to question the mysteries surrounding the case.
It could have been a drug user, it could have been an overdose. It also could have been somebody deliberately gave him a hot shot.
The discussions about what happened and the speculation could not be silenced because everyone knew that there were people who had motivation as well as means to do Sonny Liston harm.
Then on June 14th, 1982, a man named Erwin Peters walks into Las Vegas police headquarters with new evidence to share.
Erwin Peters I had used as an informant in the 70s at the Las Vegas Police Department. And I always thought he was very reliable.
He claims that the person that killed Sonny was an undercover detective that was actually at the crime scene.
To their surprise, the man Erwin names as decorated former narcotics detective, Larry Gandy.
He said I gave him a hot shot for $25,000 for Ash Resnick. That was his story. And he told him that we met at the Sahara Saloon.
I'm not trying to make a case that Ash did this, but I will say, if Ash lost his temper and wanted some physical revenge, he had people who could do it for him.
When they track Gandy down, he immediately agrees to answer the allegations.
Anybody ever say I'm ducking and dodging? I'm not. I confront my enemies and I confront the truth. That's all you need in life. They said, do you know that you were accused of killing Sonny Liston? I said, I've never met Sonny Liston. I've never talked to Sonny Liston. They asked me about Ash Resnick, and if I knew him, I said, no, I've never met him. I never talked to him. I never had any dealings with him.
According to him, Irwin had made up the whole story to set him up as a killer.
Irwin Peters is one of the best con men I ever met, and that's why he made such a great informant for me.
It seems Irwin had gotten used to the money he had made being Gandy's informant. That went away when the detective retired. But he might have come up with a new scheme to get paid.
Irwin Peters knew that I had a little money. He knew that I had access to money because I saved. I'm a saver. He was burning through all of his proceeds from his illegal gains. And on drugs, he was just, you can't keep up with a heroin burner. And so he came to me wanting more money, and I wouldn't give it to him. If Irwin Peters could have proved murder on me of Sonny Liston, it would have been worth thousands between the publicity and from Metro, and they do pay, believe me. Law enforcement operates on money, on paying informants. Not only could he sell the story, he thought, it'd get me a life sentence and get me off the streets, because I was very vindictive.
But Irwin's story is full of holes, and there is no evidence connecting Gandy to the crime.
Well, first thing, I could never be a contract killer. I wouldn't kill anybody for $25,000. The next thing is, any smart hitman, if he kills anybody, once he's paid, he kills the guy that hired him. Because everybody flips on the hitman. It always comes out. The truth always comes out.
As far as investigators are concerned, that ends their brief relook at the case. But it wouldn't put an end to the mystery. 5 years later, in 1987, Irwin Peters is found dead in his garage.
The detective called me and says, did you know that they think you killed Irwin Peters? And I said, let me ask you a question. Was every bone in his body broken? They went, no. I said, then I didn't kill him because I would have beat him to death.
His death was ultimately ruled to be an accident. The truth surrounding Sonny's death remains elusive, and it would take 3 more decades for further clues to emerge.
It was almost like the devil said, okay, Sonny, I got one more thing for you to do. Die this way and leave a mystery behind you.
In the decades since Sonny Liston's mysterious death, many theories have emerged, but none have provided any clear answers.
He's such a great enigma, and he was a great fighter. Everything is a mystery with this guy.
Toxicology reports show that there wasn't enough heroin in his body to kill him. So the coroner said that it was natural causes.
The coroner ruled Sonny died of heart failure and lung disease.
A lot of people question how an athlete could die that way.
His report had ended the possibility that Sonny's death could be investigated as a murder.
It's not like there's a long track record of mob bosses killing boxers for failing to deliver and taking a dive. I think what is on firmer ground is to say speaks to their willingness to willfully look away. The only way you get that is by somebody with some real influence and power saying, stand down. And that's what they did.
But in 2011, a discussion on an online boxing forum sheds further light on Sonny's final days.
According to the timeline, Liston was busy that week. He traveled to LA to meet with Paramount Studios about a movie deal, and also he had met with a boxer about a fight in Japan. Telephone records show that he made 2 phone calls to Geraldine and several phone calls to a hotel that he dealt drugs out of. He checked out of the Biltmore Hotel around midnight in downtown Los Angeles and then drove back to Las Vegas.
That put Sonny back at his home around 6 a.m. Wednesday, December 30th. And according to reports, he was met there by an unarmed narcotics agent who came with a message that gives more weight to a potential motive.
I think he was a snitch for John Sleeper.
John Sleeper was a controversial member of the Las Vegas Police Department who'd just been fired shortly before Sonny's death. Was it John Sleeper who paid Sonny the visit that night? And if so, why?
The speculation was that John Sleeper was there to give Sonny a warning. He had lost his job at the police department and he wouldn't be able to cover for Sonny anymore. So Sonny was now on his own.
He was always dependent upon the protection of other people. And so what happens when you lose that protection? In that sort of toxic environment, you don't have any protection when that blowback comes on you.
Did the seedy underbelly of Las Vegas catch up to Sonny despite Sleeper's warning?
It was in the opinion if somebody had killed him for being an informant for John Sleeper, that they would have injected him with a hot shot after having drinks, passed out. It only takes one load and you're gone. He was too big and too tough to say, here, I'm gonna give you a shot. Are you kidding me? Heavyweight champion of the world, he'd beat you to a pulp. If he didn't want something, you're not gonna give it to him. Whoever killed him, it had to be a total setup.
But without any evidence, it's just another murder theory.
The whole thing was a bad situation. It's never been proved. And if he was killed, the killers have probably gone to their grave.
50 years after Sonny Liston's death, we are still searching for the truth. But the more time that passes, the less likely it is we will ever find out.
There's always a question mark, but listen, he's just one of those interesting people that will always be provocative for the public. He was anticipated to be the best heavyweight of all. That doesn't pan out. The great tragedy is he may have been able to turn them around, but he just didn't have the inner strength to do it. And he just fell back to really what he was, which is a guy with criminal intent from the time he was born and just never rose out of that. The money and the fame couldn't do it. Just wasn't strong enough to rise above it.
Riverside, California is a peaceful town full of sunshine and orange groves. And the Mediterranean climate and nearby Joshua Tree National Park make it a picturesque place to live. But not even the California countryside is immune to violence. In 2008, the search for a group of brutal killers would lead investigators from a quiet bedroom community to the last place anyone expected. 50 miles east of Los Angeles, you'll find the city of Riverside. It's the largest in California's metropolitan area, known as the Inland Empire, and the birthplace of the state's citrus industry.
Riverside County is the 10th largest county in the country. It's a huge geographic area.
They had vineyards, and there's a lot of history there. Different places that you can go and explore.
Riverside's most famous landmarks are the Mission Inn and the Fox Theater.
I mean, it had everything that you could ever want. They had the little stores, and little mom and pop shops, and stuff like that.
Originally founded by the Native Americans in the 1700s, Riverside became a colony of the United States in 1870. A few years later, the first orange groves were planted. Today, Riverside and the surrounding area contains more suburban families than farmers.
It's one of those areas where you can get a lot bigger house for the money than you could in like San Diego or Orange County. It's a peaceful community. The school systems are really good.
It was a perfect place to raise, a new family.
Riverside is awesome. It's a close commute if you want to come down to San Diego. You're close to Los Angeles. And Temecula itself is a wine region, so you have all kinds of wineries and restaurants and things to do out there.
But on October 15, 2008, that peace was shattered. While most of the city gets ready for work, the Riverside County Sheriff's Office is suddenly bombarded with 911 calls. They're all concerning one young couple, Jan and Kiana Piacek.
My wife and I, we got a call early morning. The person asked, where was Kiana? Had you seen Kiana?
I was like, no, she should be at work. And her secretary said, no, she wasn't there. I said, well, let me call Yannick's phone.
When we couldn't reach Yannick's phone either, I had a really weird feeling in the pit of my stomach.
Jan is a sergeant in the Marines, and Kiana works at an infant care center. Neither one of them is known to miss work.
Both were regarded as very responsible individuals, people who wouldn't miss work without calling in sick or calling in late. It was extraordinarily out of character for each of them, and both Sergeant Piacek's supervisor and Kiana's supervisor both alerted the Sheriff's Department.
And they asked her to do what's considered a welfare check of the residents to make sure that they were okay.
We don't get a lot of serious calls coming out of that area. So when the preliminary information came in, they gave us an address. That address was within 2 or 3 miles of the courthouse, so it didn't take us long to get there.
Deputies arrived to find the Piacek's front door left open. As soon as they step inside, they're struck by the smell of gasoline. But that's not all.
As you walk down the entryway area, it opens up into kind of a great room with a large kitchen off to the right, and then the living room area off to the left with the couches. And lying by the couches were Yannick and Kiana Piacek. They've been executed. Both of them had red duct tape wrapped around their eyes. Both had their ankles and wrists taped together. There was apparent blood coming from their head. It was obvious when you walked up to the body where they had been shot.
They were killed almost execution style. Both of them were shot in the back of their heads multiple times. As an investigator, when you're coming onto a crime scene, you literally have laser focus. You're paying attention to anything and everything. Everything is important. Nothing is too small when it comes down to evidence.
Sometimes you work an investigation, you may not get all the details of the crime. But in this situation, we know exactly what happened. This is a cold-blooded murder.
Jan and Kiana Piacek were a little different from most of their Riverside County neighbors. Jan was born in Poland, and his family immigrated to the United States when he was 10 years old. They'd first settled down in Brooklyn, New York.
He had a Polish accent, and he got picked on and bullied sometimes. Despite all of that, He loved this country. He loved America so much. His mom made him a quilt of the American flag, and he slept under the American flag when he was a boy.
Jan was just a teenager when the terrorist attacks of 9/11 occurred. For a boy with such a strong sense of patriotism, there was only one thing to do.
The 9/11 attacks absolutely hit major, close to home for him.
He was very impacted by what happened and went back and told his mom that he was going to join the military. He enlisted after 9/11, quickly promoted to sergeant, was generally regarded to as an A1 Marine.
Jan was transferred to California for training, where he specialized as a mechanic. In 2005, he was deployed to Iraq, but shortly before he left, Jan met the young woman who'd become his wife.
Kiana was at San Diego, and her best friend gave a party for some Marines that were going to Iraq. And Kiana, typical Kiana, she was in the back room studying.
Kiana was best friends with our friend's girlfriend. Yannick, made up his mind that he wanted to date her and get to know her better. I don't think she wanted to date Marines, but he was persistent and I think kind of got her number and got to talk to her.
But Jan would have to wait until his tour of duty was over to pick up where he'd left off.
They gave the guys a welcome home party, and finally she gave him the time of day.
Jan had a lot of personality, great sense of humor, tried to make everything fun and enjoyable, really liked to enjoy life, but was also a really hard worker. Once she saw who he really was as a person, I think that she fell in love with him equally as he fell in love with her.
She brought him home and she said, I think this is the one. I said, are you sure? She says, yeah, Daddy. I think he's the one I'm going to marry. I said, okay, well, if he's good enough for you, then, he's good enough for me.
In the summer of 2008, the couple got married.
She planned everything. She picked the colors. Her and Yannick did everything on their own. And that's what made it special.
And this was in a wine vineyard on a beautiful, perfect San Diego day with Marines and dress blues and his beautiful wife and all her bridesmaids.
I can remember all the bridesmaids wearing Converse. That's what Kiana wanted. She had white Converse on, and it was just awesome to be there and to witness the wedding and to witness the union, and everybody just seemed to be so happy.
After the wedding, Jan and Kiana moved into their first home in Winchester, a mostly working-class community just south of Riverside.
2 stories, backyard, remodeled kitchen. Not a lot of enlisted Marines, get into a house that beautiful.
Perfect neighborhood, more or less, for a newlywed couple to begin, their new lives together.
But the newlyweds would never even get the chance to finish unpacking.
We were just celebrating their wedding, and now they're dead.
I couldn't process it. Who would harm them? Why?
"30 miles south of Riverside, California, is the quiet suburb of Winchester.
The area where Jan and Piacek had bought a home was actually in Riverside County, in an area considered Winchester or French Valley.
It was just to the north of the city of Temecula, which is a highly populated residential and commercial city.
Winchester was a mostly rural area until a construction boom during the early 2000s. The affordable housing was attractive to military families stationed at nearby Camp Pendleton. Among them were Jan and Kiana Piacek.
Kiana worked in Paris, and Yannick was at Camp Pendleton. So that area was in between both of their jobs.
They knew what they wanted right away, and that was to be married, that was to buy their home, and that was to build a family together.
But now, the couple have become the victims of a horrific double homicide, and investigators are determined to find out why.
Typically, the violence that we see in those areas is related to drugs and other things like that. We don't have, thankfully, that many situations where completely innocent people are targeted in a murder like this.
Right away, you could see that there's shoe impressions on the tile floor. You can smell gasoline in the house.
Our first impression walking in was whatever happened there, they were trying to destroy evidence by trying to catch the house on fire.
It appeared that they tried using several methods, one being turning the gas to the oven on and leaving it on. Several small areas within the house that had been lit on fire, it didn't end up causing a large fire.
At first glance, the evidence seems to point toward a robbery gone wrong.
But the home had been searched. They'd also emptied the contents of purses and opened wallets.
There were cabinets that were open. There were drawers with items removed in several of the bedrooms, the kitchen, that were consistent with potential robbery.
Whoever did it spent time going through the house, ransacking the house, looking for items.
However, the way Jan and Kiana were killed tells detectives there is much more to the story.
Kiana and Jan Piacek were shot 2 times in the head each. In my 18, 20 years of investigating, it's one of the more brutal crime scenes that I've ever seen.
Sergeant Piacek had been beaten in the living room. Kiana had been taken away to other areas of the residence, that she had been stripped.
There was evidence at the scene that indicated that Kiana was sexually assaulted.
This is not something that happened in an instant. There was a prolonged period of physical, mental, emotional, and sexual torture that took place.
One person's not going to do that. So from the beginning, we knew that it was going to be more than at least one person involved.
With this particular killing, because of the level of the brutality that was involved, it was a key indicator to the police that this was a personal attack.
As you continue through the house, there's spray painting where somebody wrote the N-word lover in silver spray paint on the wall.
It was in big letters on the mirror, and it was big letters on the wall. It was obvious that whoever wrote it there wanted us to see that.
To investigators, this suddenly looks more like a hate crime.
It's possible at that point that we could be looking at a racial issue. Maybe there's people that have a problem with the fact that a white man is married to a black female.
The very first thing we got to do is talk to their family members.
They asked, did they have enemies? Did they have anybody that, that were mad at them? And I couldn't, point the finger at anybody.
There was not one name on a list. We could tell them a grudge, an old boyfriend, a girlfriend, nobody.
But Kiana's mother does remember one thing that catches investigators' attention.
I talked to her the night before. I could do every night. And she called to say goodnight. And I could hear her, on the speakerphone. She's walking around, putting the alarm on the house. So it's like, how'd they get in the house? How'd they get in without the alarm going off?
There was no damage to the front door or the lock, anything suggesting any type of forced entry. It was apparent that whoever entered the residence had gained access by being let into the residence.
Was it possible Jan and Kiana knew their killers?
The alarm had been turned off, so it would indicate to us that at least the victims had some familiarity with who came to the door.
We had so many questions. Who would hate somebody so much that you would break in their house in the middle of the night and murder them?
If Jan and Kiana's murder was a hate crime, it would belong to a protected class of crimes.
If you attack or kill someone based on their age, race, or gender, it usually comes with a much higher sentence in most cases. That fact is supposed to make most people think twice, but I don't find that to be the case. Unfortunately, the harsher sentences really haven't done a lot. Hate crimes have still been on the rise.
News about the brutal murders of Jan and Kiana Piecic leave their families and their Southern California community reeling.
Within the community of Riverside County, within the Marine Corps, there was a complete shock that this crime had occurred.
A lot of their family, the last time that they had seen Sergeant Piecic and Kiana before the funeral was at their wedding. That was the nature of the timing between their wedding and their murders.
I don't think it ever really hit until we actually had to arrive at the funeral. And just knowing that there's 2 caskets and your cousin's in them.
We had the funeral at my mom's church, and the main hall held 500, and they actually had to open up another room. The type of person that Kiana and Yannick were. I mean, you know, they touched the lives of a lot of people.
Meanwhile, Riverside County detectives are hard at work tracking down their killers.
Because they found multiple footprints throughout the house, that was an indicator that they were looking for more than one suspect.
There were 3 distinct shoe tread patterns that our forensic tech used latent print powder, the way they would recover fingerprints. We took those shoe tread patterns, went to a shoe store in the mall. The employee there described one as being consistent with a Nike Air Force One, another pattern being consistent with the Nike LeBron 4, and the other Nike Cortez.
We knew that if we found somebody and we were looking at the soles of their shoes, we would have a pretty good idea if they had been there or not.
But first, they would need suspects to compare the prints to. And so far, the police don't have any leads.
The first couple of days in any investigation are crucial. But if you don't have any suspects, it can almost lead into you running into a brick wall.
It was frustrating. It was like every day after the initial incident, the case gets colder and you seem further away from solving it.
There was no focus on a person of interest or even a group of interest at that point.
Even the evidence that suggested this was a hate crime seems to fall apart under closer scrutiny.
One of the first things we had to do is try to determine, is this a racially motivated crime by some kind of hate group? When we started looking at what the spray painting could be, we had our crime analysts do searches for crimes that had been committed in the general area of where the murders happened, looking for anything that could be as simple as vandalism. And during their search of those crimes, there was just nothing similar in the area.
Typically, in these types of cases or involving racial violence, there are certain signs or symbols that are common. None of those associated common signs or symbols were present on the walls of the Sergeant Piecic home.
The slurs were written right above where that one burn pile was. Why spray paint these types of words to throw law enforcement off if you're going to actually just burn the entire house down to destroy all evidence?
It could be that these things were written on the wall simply to misdirect investigators and to lead them to believe that it was race-related when it wasn't.
We were pretty sure fairly quickly that was just a red herring to throw us off. Based off of that, my partner and I were pretty confident in saying that this wasn't a racially motivated crime.
It's beginning to look like investigators may never find the killers. But then, they finally get the break they've been looking for.
The real first lead that we got was when Riverside Sheriff's Department was able to find out that Kiana's ATM card was used right outside the back gate at Camp Pendleton.
After the murders occur, her bank card is used at a Washington Mutual bank branch in Fallbrook, California. That $400 is taken out of her account. Through that, we're also able to find that those ATM machines have cameras on them.
Detectives reviewed the camera footage, but unfortunately, the suspects had been careful to cover their tracks.
For the people who used the ATM card at that location were sophisticated enough to cover their faces completely with bandanas.
Blue bandanas were used to mask that subject's face, and the subject was wearing Mechanics brand black gloves with the white letters on it. So you could see those two things that stood out to us.
Police may not be able to identify the killers yet, but at least now they know where they went.
It was significant because of the proximity to Camp Pendleton. Our victim, Jan, worked at Camp Pendleton. There were some theories of the possibility that the suspects responsible for this were also in the military.
There's really no reason anybody would be going to Fallbrook directly after a murder unless they lived in Fallbrook. We're heading to Camp Pendleton. The fact that it was so close to the back gate indicated to us that they were most likely going to Camp Pendleton.
Could Jan and Kiana's killers actually be fellow Marines?
You could kind of see things clicking. All arrows really pointed to Camp Pendleton.
A week into the investigation, Riverside County detectives believe the suspects in the brutal murders of Sergeant Jan Piacek and his wife Kiana might be fellow Marines.
It was probably challenging for the investigators to have to suspect that Marines may possibly be involved with this case. I mean, most people look at the military as our heroes.
Camp Pendleton is a Marine Corps base located 40 miles south of Winchester. It is the largest military facility in California, giving investigators more than 100,000 potential suspects to consider.
Camp Pendleton truly is its own city. You have housing there where you have active duty military members that live there with their families. There are schools there. There's a grocery store called a commissary.
Once the information started coming out that there was potentially an angle that involved military service members, then obviously the Sheriff's Department had to reach out to NCIS for their cooperation in gaining access to base.
A military base is a different jurisdiction, so the police would have to work with the military in regards to conducting any kind of investigation.
NCIS offers a lot to civilian departments investigating crimes, specifically homicides. We can offer forensics assistance, we can offer investigative assistance, and we can also kind of navigate the military world.
NCIS was instrumental in allowing the Central Homicide Unit to do this investigation because they needed special permission from the base commander, and they need to be escorted throughout the base by NCIS personnel.
After securing permission from Camp Pendleton's commanders, investigators start interviewing the Marines serving in Jan's unit.
One of the things that we wanted to try and do is establish who had daily contact with Jan Piacek. In particular, who worked for him, who worked around him, who were his friends, and to determine if anybody had any kind of animus against Sergeant Piacek.
The initial people that we talked to were like, we have no idea why this would happen. He was a hard-working Marine.
But detectives soon discover that Sergeant Piacek wasn't popular with all his troops.
Some guys thought he was like riding them, and I guess they didn't like him.
He was restationed in Camp Pendleton at a training squadron. So this is a different environment than a mission-ready Marine Corps squadron. This is a training group. He went there to try to implement better Marine Corps culture with this group of Marines. And obviously they didn't appreciate it.
And there was one Marine in particular who took issue with Jan's leadership style.
We had another Marine come forward and tell us about a problem that had arisen with another Marine named Tyrone Miller. And we met with this Marine off base. He told us about receiving the information about Tyrone Miller hating Sergeant P. That Sergeant P had made comments to Tyrone Miller that he was going to have a bad performance evaluation.
It comes out that he was planning on blocking Miller's promotion. So this may have been a good motive as to why this murder happened.
Tyrone Miller actually had made a statement after the murders were discovered that, I feel bad that Kiana's dead, but I don't care that Sergeant P is dead.
But was Tyrone Miller actually angry enough to kill his commanding officer?
Having discovered that Lance Corporal Miller had some animus against Sergeant Piacek, we decided to bring him to Camp Pendleton to the NCIS headquarters.
Investigator Wortman and I told him we were following up on the investigation of Sergeant P's murder and explained to him that this was a voluntary interview, that if he wanted to leave, he could. He said, no, this is no problem. I liked Sergeant P.
As we spoke to him, we started asking questions that I would call alibi statements that you would ask almost anybody. Where were you during this time? Were you in this particular area?
We asked him basically in the manner of, we don't have your cell phone records now, but if we obtain them, would there be any reason your phone records would show you in the area of the victims the night of the murder? And he said they shouldn't. That stood out to us because it's not a strong denial.
Their suspicions are raised even further when Tyrone describes what he was wearing on the night of the murder.
He very simply could have just said, I wear casual clothes, but he instead decided to say, well, he wears his Air Force Ones.
He's wearing shoes that leave the same tread pattern as those that were found at the crime scene.
When we both left that interview, I think we both believed that he was somehow involved.
Because Jan and Kiana's murder involved Marines, the NCIS played a big role in the investigation.
Homicide investigations can be difficult, and it's more complicated when there's more hurdles that you have to jump through. You have to conduct an investigation differently when it involves any division of armed forces. Suddenly, there's certain procedures that have to be followed. I wouldn't have any jurisdiction on a military base.
The terrifying double murders of Jan and Kiana Piacek have taken investigators from the Southern California suburbs to the barracks of Camp Pendleton. And after interviewing Lance Corporal Tyrone Miller, they are now convinced they're closing in on the killers.
In our discussions with the investigative team on the case, we all agreed that what Mr. Miller said was suspicious. We thought there was enough to get over the probable cause hurdle to get a search warrant to look into him further.
This is where things may happen a little differently in this investigation because police can't serve a warrant on a military base.
We had to take our state search warrant to the magistrate on the base, get their permission, then we were able to start serving search warrants at Miller's base housing.
On October 29, 2008, investigators from Riverside County and the NCIS coordinate to search Miller's home on the base.
At that time, we used a ram to open the door, announcing that the police get down. As we turned the corner into the hallway, we noticed that Lance Corporal Miller had picked up his toddler and he was using his toddler as a shield, backing up towards the back bedroom. In all my time as a special agent, I've never, ever heard or seen a suspect pick up his child and use it as a shield. This was despicable. Thankfully, Lance Corporal Miller got down and we made the arrest.
While NCIS agents detain Miller, investigators begin collecting evidence.
Inside that house, the investigators found Sergeant Piacek's home address scribbled on a piece of paper that was concealed inside a couch. A cache of firearms, some of which were stolen.
Kiana's ATM card was right out in the open. I think it was on top of a dresser drawer. Jewelry belonging to both of them were there.
There was also a backpack. Inside of the backpack were the mechanics brand gloves that were visible on the ATM surveillance video, as well as blue bandanas. It was pointed out to me that there were expended casings that appeared to have blood on them. What they found, I think, cannot be described to anything other than a treasure trove of evidence.
Back at NCIS headquarters, detectives give Miller a second chance to come clean.
You let him tell his original story again, and then that's when you confront him with, well, I just found her credit card in your house. I just found his watch in your house. How do you explain that? And that's when you can see just everything drain out, where he shows he's defeated, and he starts telling the story about what happened.
Faced with that evidence, Tyrone Miller finally admits that he and some other Marines were at the Piachiks' home on the night of the murders, but insists he didn't kill anyone.
He describes going to the house. He admits to hitting Sergeant P. He admits that they taped him up.
They overtook him, pointed guns at him.
Lance Corporal Miller really portrayed himself as just a person on the fringe of this crime. He was simply somebody that was just standing by.
He was just going there to beat up Sergeant P because he was angry at him because of the bad performance evaluations. You know, it was these other people that did the sexual assault.
Miller claims his plan was already spiraling out of control. But then one of the other Marines decided to get rid of the sergeant for good.
He identifies that the shooter was a person by the name of Emery's John.
Emery's John was also a fellow Marine who had started out in Sergeant Piachak's unit.
He said Emery's John said that Sergeant P was going to recognize their voices and that they had to kill him. And that Emery's John walked over to both of them and shot both victims in the head.
Based on Miller's statement, investigators immediately bring John in for questioning.
During that initial interview, Emery's John steadfastly denies that he had anything to do with the murders. Emery's John couldn't comprehend how anybody could do this to someone like that.
But the evidence found in his barracks tell a different story.
Inside of his residence, they found a Nike Cortez shoe, which was consistent with the impressions that were found at the crime scene.
When later they were tested by Riverside Sheriff's Laboratory, they found Jan Piatek's blood on the shoe.
2 of the 3 shoe prints found at the murder scene have now been accounted for. And facing murder charges, the suspects are quick to give up their accomplices.
Tyrone Miller tells him that someone named Kevin Cox was with him as well. Investigators then went to speak to Kevin Cox. And Cox eventually admitted that yes, he'd been there as well, and he mentioned a 4th.
He had described the 4th suspect as going by the name Psycho. So we had that name, but we didn't know who it belonged to.
When we do search for Kevin Cox's barracks room, we find his cell phone, and in his phone is the nickname Psycho. NCIS ran that phone number through their system, and we were able to identify Keyshawn Sykes.
A search of Sykes' apartment uncovers more of Kiana's stolen jewelry.
This is how investigations go sometime. You never know what's going to happen. You struggle sometime, and then you run into a brick wall, and then all of a sudden it just breaks.
Between the search warrants on Miller's house, the barracks rooms for Emery's John and Kevin Cox, and the apartment that Keyshawn Sykes was living in, we found everything that we needed.
Investigators also discover proof that this wasn't the first time this group of Marines committed a crime together.
As we're going through property that's being recovered from all the places that we're doing search warrants, we're able to link that to robberies that have been occurring other places.
We found IDs, jewelry that did not belong to Jan or Kiana, an inordinate amount of jewelry, lots of weapons, others bonds in other people's names.
We happened to have found a crew that were doing other burglaries and robberies.
We were able to put together a picture of how this group was terrorizing people that lived anywhere near Camp Pendleton and had been getting away with it for a long time.
They were getting desensitized to what they were doing. John and Kiana were unfortunate enough to be one of the later home invasions they did, and they obviously pushed it all the way on this one.
On November 3rd, 2008, the Riverside County Sheriff's Department arrests all 4 Marines.
Tyron Miller, Emery's John, Kevin Cox, and Keyshawn Sykes, all 4 of them were charged with capital murder.
When the newlyweds Jan and Kiana Piacek bought their home together in Winchester, California, it was supposed to be a new beginning. Instead, their lives had come to a grisly end.
It's just hard to believe why somebody would do this to somebody as loving and caring as Kiana and Yana were.
There's so many more victims to the crime than just John and Kiana. It's everybody, it's their family, it's their friends, it's all the loss.
The impact on their community grows even worse once the names of the killers are released.
The most heart-wrenching thing for me, they're fellow Marines.
That was the hardest thing, to find out 2 of them were actually indigent.
They wore the uniform, but they weren't Marines. They were armed robbers, and that's all they'll ever be in my mind.
On August 12, 2009, a Riverside County judge orders the 4 defendants to be tried for murder.
Unique in this situation is the fact that you have 2 potential outcomes for prosecution. You have the United States Marine Corps, which can prosecute the offenders, or it could be tried out in town under the state of California and the California Penal Code. The decision was made as the crime occurred in Riverside County that the prosecution would happen in Riverside County.
Tyron Miller, Emery's John, Kevin Cox, and Keyshawn Sykes all entered not guilty pleas. That places the burden on the prosecution team to prove the charges that we've alleged against them.
But before their trials can even begin, Keyshawn Sykes threatens to derail the proceedings.
So there was a time in Keyshawn Sykes' pretrial litigation where he stood up and started talking incoherently and taking what appeared to be urine and spreading it across the courtroom. That forced the defense team to have him evaluated.
The court has to decide whether that person is considered competent or not.
The jury ended up finding that there was not enough evidence to believe that he was incompetent. Criminal proceedings were reinstated.
The court decides to hold separate trials, one for John, Miller, and Cox, and one for Sykes. On April 8, 2013, the first trial gets underway at the Riverside Hall of Justice.
They bring them out in orange jumpsuit. It's a crazy experience to now be in the same room and this close to all these guys.
Sit there in the courtroom and watch them smile and laugh and make jokes. It was funny to them. It wasn't funny to us.
In his statement to police, Tyrone Miller claimed Emery's John was responsible for the murders. But in their opening statement, prosecutors revealed they have a very different story from the other Marines.
All the perpetrators indicated that it was Lance Corporal Miller who was in charge. It was Lance Corporal Miller who planned this terrible event. And it was under Lance Corporal Miller's direction that they did this deed.
So the suspect said that John was the one who shot them, but they also said that it was Miller who gave the order. When the first bullet didn't kill Kiana, Miller ordered them to shoot her again.
If it wasn't for him, they'd still be alive.
However, Miller sticks to his story, claiming that he only intended to confront Sergeant Piacek, not to kill him.
The purpose of them going there was to go and talk to Yana. But you don't go to somebody's house in the middle of the night to talk.
Prosecutors present a key piece of evidence that proves Miller played a bigger role in the crime.
One of those mechanics gloves had Tyrone Miller's initials inside the gloves, and those gloves turned out to have very significant DNA evidence linking him to the sexual assault that had taken place inside the residence.
The level of depravity to include Kiana and Lance Corporal Miller's quest for vengeance against Sergeant Piatek is truly tragic.
They knew exactly what they do. To sit here and say it wasn't our intention, it was an accident or whatever, no. That's not going to fly.
Kevin Cox also tries to minimize his involvement.
Kevin Cox's defense team focused their arguments on the fact that Kevin Cox said he was a lookout and that he was not in the house at the time of all the worst things that happened.
One of the attorneys said, well, while you were standing outside, how come you didn't call the police? How come you didn't try to stop it?
It doesn't matter that Emery's John was the one that pulled the trigger. All four of those people sealed Kiana and Yannick's fate that night when they went to that door. They didn't try to talk anybody out of going to that house. They did everything to further the crime and nothing to prevent it.
They were trained, and they used that training to kill my children.
The juries deliberate for several days before rendering their decisions.
Ultimately, the trial led to guilty verdicts for all four.
Tyrone Miller was also convicted of sexual assault.
The jury evaluating Tyrone Miller's punishment and Emery John's punishment decided that they were both deserving of the ultimate punishment, the sentence of death. Kevin Cox's jury ended up deciding that life without parole was a more fitting punishment.
A year later, Keyshawn Sykes stands trial. He is also found guilty and sentenced to death.
That's when I felt closure. That at least we got to the people that did it and brought them to justice.
With the four killers off the streets, the city of Riverside can breathe a sigh of relief. But for the families of Jan and Kiana Piatek, nothing will ever be the same.
Justice was served, court justice, but as far as I'm concerned, it's no release for me. No.
You don't know how you keep going. You got good days, we got bad days. A lot more bad than good, but we keep going because of Kiana.
But as time goes on, you realize what you're missing out on from this person. You realize how fragile life is and how things could look totally different tomorrow.
I don't know what the future holds for Roy and I, but wherever it is, Kiana's going with us. Yana could be right there too.
Washington, D.C. is a city synonymous with power. From the White House to the Pentagon, it is a symbol of America's influence, both at home and abroad. But D.C. and its suburbs in Maryland and Virginia have another side, one that has nothing to do with politics. It's a sprawling metropolitan area with over 6 million residents. And in 2002, they were all living in fear of a dangerous serial killer who was stalking their streets. Washington, D.C. is more than just the capital of the United States. It's also an important cultural center full of national landmarks.
It's a repository of our founding documents, monuments to our greatest leaders.
Beautiful parks, beautiful museums, tourists walking around with their kids and look at the rich history.
It is also a city that is rich in diversity.
DC is an international city because it's really the host to the world. We have the largest diplomatic delegation in the world.
You have people here from all different walks of life. You have politicians, ambassadors, activists from all over the world, but you also have hard-working, working-class citizens who keep the city running, and they have nothing to do with politics.
DC's prominent black community has been an important part of its identity since the 1800s.
From the time before the Civil War and certainly after the Civil War, with Reconstruction and huge in-migration of African Americans moving out of the South because of oppression down there and mechanization of the farms. DC was emancipated before Lincoln issued the General Proclamation, so there's the history of the fight for civil rights.
Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King did his I Have a Dream speech here.
I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation.
It's a city that has a lot of pride within the African American community.
To this day, the city is still roughly, if not a little bit more, than 50-50 African Americans.
And while the city itself is home to more than 700,000, the greater metropolitan area contains over 6 million, a vast suburban sprawl that stretches into the neighboring states of Maryland and Virginia.
Many of the people who live and work here refer to this area as the DMV, which stands for DC, Maryland, and Virginia.
The DMV, which I thought was just a place you go to renew your driver's license and your registration when I first moved here. It has a life of its own.
Most of us who live and work in the area go in and out of each of those states or regions almost every day.
Locals don't make much of a distinction between the different areas. As far as they're concerned, they're all a part of the same community, a very desirable community.
Some of the most affluent counties in the country are in the Washington, D.C. area. Fairfax County in Virginia, Loudoun County in Virginia. In Maryland, just outside D.C., Prince George's County is the most affluent, predominantly black county in the country. You know, there are areas that need more attention than some other areas, but it's a pretty middle class to upper middle class community.
Still, like most urban areas, the DMV region has dealt with its share of crime.
There was a point in time back in the 80s and maybe early 90s when the crime rate, especially the violent crime around DC and the surrounding areas, was very high.
And it was all generated primarily because of drugs, crack cocaine.
Through a coordinated effort by state, city, and federal authorities, the worst of the region's drug problems were eventually brought under control. Since then, the overall crime rate has been on the decline. And things seem to be looking up for the nation's capital until September 11th, 2001.
Everyone knows the terrorist attacks took place in New York, Shanksville, Pennsylvania, and here in Washington at the Pentagon. All of a sudden, there's this big, billowing black smoke coming from the Pentagon, and there are fighter jets scrambling and flying over the city. It was a tough time, but we got through the immediate impact of 9/11. After that, the city continued to be nervous because you never knew when the next shoe would drop.
It was in the wake of 9/11 that the DMV would be targeted by another kind of homegrown terrorism. Just a year later, it would become a hunting ground for one of the country's most notorious serial killers. October 3rd, 2002, at 7:41 a.m., 39-year-old landscaper James Sonny Buchanan is working outside a car dealership. 17 miles north of D.C. in the Maryland suburb of Rockville, when suddenly he collapses.
He was cutting the grass between the street and the sidewalk. He stumbles away from his lawnmower and he falls over. One of the employees says, "Hey, Mr. Buchanan's down." They're running out. The first thought is, uh-oh, heart attack.
But when the dealership employees arrive, they find Sonny covered in blood.
Obviously, this was something much more serious than a heart attack, so they immediately called 911.
Sonny is rushed to a nearby hospital, where doctors make a startling discovery.
He had been shot. The emergency crews, they were anticipating some sort of a trauma from an accident. They weren't expecting a bullet hole.
Unfortunately, it's too late to save his life. Sonny is pronounced dead from a single gunshot wound to the torso. Meanwhile, investigators arrive at the scene.
When there's a shooting, one of the first things that you want to know is that were there any witnesses? But in this case, nobody saw anything.
Montgomery County, Maryland was always considered an extremely safe county to live in.
At the time, it seems like a completely random act of violence. But as investigators will soon discover, it's only the first of many.
There wasn't any thought of this being the beginning of a nightmare.
30 minutes later, at a gas station in nearby Aspen Hill, a 54-year-old taxi driver named Prem Kumar Walakar is also shot and killed.
Mr. Walakar was in a local gas station, filling up his tank for the day. Nothing remarkable about him. He's pumping gas. Shot rings out. Down he goes.
A loud shot was heard by many witnesses, but nobody saw anything. There was a pediatrician pumping gas in a minivan with her baby in the car. She heard the shot and immediately saw a victim staggering towards her car. He, in fact, fell against her car, slid down the side of her minivan, blood everywhere, and she ran over to him with her cell phone, starting to call 911.
The two cases aren't immediately connected, but then investigators receive news of a third fatal shooting just a few miles south. The victim is Sarah Ramos, a 35-year-old immigrant from El Salvador.
A young lady sitting on a park bench, fatally shot, reading a book, just randomly.
This shooting happened at 8:30, so now you've got 3 shootings under an hour within a 5-mile radius of each other. This time, someone did spot a possible shooter.
There was a witness that heard the shot, looked up, and happened to see a white van or truck moving out of the parking lot.
But investigators have just started searching for the vehicle when yet another call comes in. At 9:58 a.m., 25-year-old Lori Ann Lewis Rivera is shot and killed while vacuuming her van at a Kensington, Maryland gas station.
There's bodies dropping in Montgomery County. We're having people shot faster than we can respond. And it's continuing to a couple of hours, and it's every 30 minutes someone's being shot. We're under attack. We need help.
The unexplained shooting spree has Montgomery County Police on high alert. The killer is on the move, tracing a route from Rockville to Silver Spring, and appears to be making a beeline for the nation's capital.
These shootings that were taking place were causing such terror. When things started happening just 1 year after 9/11, people were pretty much on eggshells.
The D.C. suburb of Montgomery County, Maryland, is a relatively peaceful area.
There are nearly 1 million people living in this county, which is one of the most affluent in the United States. So when you drive through, you'll see government offices, scientific research facilities, and even business campuses.
But by 10 a.m. on October 3rd, 2001, Montgomery County Police find themselves investigating 4 unexplained shootings.
Their homicide rate just more than tripled in a couple of hours. There didn't seem to be any discrimination. It was men, it was women.
People pumping gas, people in the parking lots at their local shopping center.
As investigators begin connecting the dots between the shootings, they discover there had actually been a 5th victim killed the night before.
The first thing that they found out is that there was a manager at a craft store that reported that she had heard a gunshot and a bullet broke her front window as she was closing up for the day.
No one was injured, but when police searched the store, they found a high-caliber rifle bullet. And little more than a half hour later, the shooter struck again. At 6 p.m., a 55-year-old program analyst named James Martin had been shot and killed outside a grocery store in nearby Wheaton, Maryland.
Just a guy stopping on his way home from work to pick up some groceries. People around him initially thought the man had had a heart attack and had fallen over.
As with the other crime scenes, no one had seen the shooter, and now investigators believe they know why.
When you don't have witnesses who observed the shooting, one of the things that you can attempt is trajectory. We could tell that some of these shots were being taken from a distance.
You're talking about a sniper who used a high-caliber rifle to pick people off. That had to be terrifying to investigators.
Of course, the first thing you think is this a terror attack? What's happening?
So far, all of the shootings have occurred in suburban Maryland. But on the night of October 3rd, the sniper arrives in the nation's capital.
If you were living in the city, you were seeing reports of the shooting throughout the day. You were hearing about it, and suddenly it's getting closer and closer. And then it's here. The shooter is in D.C.
Just after 9:15 p.m., the D.C. Metropolitan Police receive a 911 call about a shooting on Georgia Avenue, about a block inside the city limits. The victim is 72-year-old Pascal Charlot.
He was a Haitian immigrant whose family said he came here to really live out the American dream.
Pascal was a retired carpenter, shot while crossing the street at Georgia Avenue and Calmia Road.
Pascal Charlot was literally walking on a main street here in Washington, D.C., and he became D.C.'s first sniper victim.
He wasn't just the first victim shot inside of D.C., he was also the first black victim. So there was a lot of fear in the community because there just didn't seem to be any rhyme or reason to any of it.
There was this gradual realization, I think, that any one of us could be a target.
Pascal is pronounced dead less than an hour later.
Of course, Metropolitan Police Department now is going to run the lead on that shooting in the district. But it was very, very obvious from the onset. This was connected.
The next morning, on October 4th, Maryland's chief medical examiner performs autopsies. He's able to extract multiple bullet fragments from the victims, which police hope they can use to identify the weapon.
This case was fast-tracked. Bullets that were being recovered from bodies, from the scenes, were all taken to ATF. They very quickly were able to determine they were .223 caliber weapon, and it was most likely a Bushmaster rifle.
The .223 caliber is a military-grade weapon of choice, and the reason for that is it hits off of bone and fragments and tears through the human body.
In this case, he used a .223 rifle, which means that he's very skilled. He wasn't concerned about recoil because there's always recoil with a high-caliber rifle such as this. We're dealing with somebody that is a skilled marksman, and they're motivated.
If these were semi-trained, military style, there was a shooter, there was a spotter, they had an exit route, which obviously from the shootings, nobody had seen anything. We're looking for this white van. Somebody's driving it, somebody's shooting. It did eliminate that we had multiple sniper teams because the same rifle was being used for all of these victims.
Investigators now set their sights on a team of 2 snipers working together. In just over 24 hours, 6 people have been murdered, but the snipers are just getting started.
Those of us in law enforcement have never seen anything like it, this kind of terror.
These are some folks that have some dedication to whatever their sick mission is. This isn't going to stop until we stop them.
The terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001 shook the nation to its core. But for the DMV, a daily terror was just beginning.
But I think people forget that a week later, the anthrax scare started. There were CEOs and members of Congress that were receiving suspicious anonymous envelopes with a white substance in them. They ended up having to lock the buildings down. 5 people died who handled the letters. So when you talk about the DC sniper, you have to remember that the city had spent an entire year living in fear.
It's only been a year since the residents of Washington, D.C. witnessed a plane crash into the Pentagon in the attacks of 9/11. And now the entire DMV is under siege once again, this time by unknown snipers.
In the wake of 9/11, it was the first domestic terrorism of a serial killing kind.
It turned panic into scared to the point of no one would move. Now no one is on the street. We're talking the nation's capital, no cars moving. Schools went into lockdown.
Investigators have linked all 6 shootings to the same gun, but they still have no idea who is pulling the trigger.
These shootings were not limited to any sex or any race. There were men shot, there were women shot, there were Caucasian people shot, African Americans being shot.
They didn't travel in the same circles. There was no connection.
And that was very frustrating for those of us in law enforcement.
While Maryland and D.C. police coordinate their investigations, the snipers strike again. 2:30 p.m. on October 4th, 2002, one day after the sniper attacks began, police in nearby Fredericksburg, Virginia, respond to a shooting at a local craft store.
Caroline Sewell was shot while she was putting her items in the back of her van. She was airlifted to Fairfax County and operated on immediately, and fortunately was one of the survivors.
Caroline becomes the 7th person shot in less than 48 hours.
This was a really interesting crime scene in that there had already been a Michaels on October 2nd, the day before the big shooting spree.
Investigators are looking for connections between any of the victims. They're also looking at the locations of the shootings. Is it a coincidence that these shootings were happening at gas stations and convenience stores?
Is there some motivation here that someone is mad at this particular business? Is this a employee that's been fired?
The same day, a multi-jurisdictional task force of city, state, and federal agencies is created to locate and stop the killings.
The FBI, United States Marshals, ATF, DEA agents. If they were within 75 miles of Washington, D.C., they were being brought in to work this case.
This was the largest response to a serial killer in U.S. history. We had over 60 law enforcement entities here in the DMV. You have hundreds of investigators running out hundreds of leads.
Profilers were talking about different profiles, and one of the things that came up was a white male, possibly military history.
We know we're dealing with a high-powered .223 caliber rifle. We're tracking down anybody that owned a rifle, had even thought about owning a rifle. We're tracking down anybody that's connected to any of these businesses where these crimes had occurred.
The task force is also searching for a vehicle spotted near the scene of the 3rd shooting.
We're tracking down everybody that owned a white van, everybody that's rented a white van in the last 6 months.
You don't realize how many white panel vans there are. until you start looking for them. There are hundreds of thousands of white panel vans out there.
The task force also begins to hold regular press briefings to share information and enlist the public's help.
Certainly encourage everyone to remain cautious.
The media in this case was, there's no other word to describe it but circus.
You couldn't turn on a TV, or you couldn't turn on a radio, you couldn't pick up a newspaper for those weeks without seeing something about the DC snipers going on.
Hours pass with no further leads, and one thing seems clear. It's not a question of if, but when the snipers will kill again.
As investigators, all you can do is just wait for the next shooting. This is a situation that essentially you never want to be in. You just have to hope that they're going to make a mistake.
However, the weekend comes and goes without incident, causing everyone to wonder, did the shooters decide to stop? Or was this the calm before the storm?
The feeling was, okay, maybe this is over. Still a problem because we got to catch these guys, but there was this feeling of, okay, we've gotten through something awful.
But on Monday, their worst fears are realized when the snipers pick a new target and amplifies the DMV's fear to a whole new level.
Then a few days later, I think it was October 7th, a child was shot.
After 7 shootings in 3 days, everyone living in the DMV is on edge. But things are about to get even worse when another call comes in from Prince George County in Maryland.
Up until that point, all the victims were adults. But on October the 7th, the 8th victim, Iran Brown, was shot outside of his school.
The snipers moved to Benjamin Tasker Middle School.
It was a regular day. I was actually suspended from the school bus, and my aunt had to take me to and from school. She let me out in front of the school, and it was a loud bang, like a grenade went off. I fell back like the movies where you just see blood just gushing out and just pouring all over the place. And I actually was covering my wound, fighting for air, praying. My aunt is calling me to the car, and we get in, and at this point, I'm losing blood.
Iran's aunt immediately rushes him to the nearest hospital.
I can recall my aunt running inside to get help, and I'm just sitting in the car, just still trying to stay alive, just fighting for my life. And I see everyone rushing back with a wheelchair, and I can recall being wheeled inside all the way up to them putting me on the table and cutting my clothes off.
Miraculously, he survives. After emergency surgery, he is put into a medically induced coma to heal.
I had to learn how to walk again. I had to learn how to talk again.
The shooting of Iran Brown became even more personal to the law enforcement. It was really emotional, and I've always said that that day, it changed everything in my career. I'd never had a victim that was a youth.
Of course, when a child goes down, it is a full, all-out response. If it wasn't personal before, it is now.
While searching the crime scene, the task force finds a piece of evidence near the school.
The investigators found a spot in the woods with a shell casing. And next to the shell casing was a plastic bag with a tarot card in it.
I don't know a lot about tarot cards. I know fortune tellers use them. Each card has a separate meaning to it. This card was the Death's Head card that represented death. And on this card was written very sloppy, almost childish handwriting, "Call me God." That tells me we're dealing with someone now that really is way, way out there. These killers now have a God complex.
Investigators also find a pen they believe was used to write the note. All of this new evidence is sent to a crime lab for testing. When the media learns of this newest development, panic in the DC area reaches a new high.
Call me God, that's a pretty dramatic thing to leave out there. It kind of elevated it into this, okay, we're dealing with a twisted person with their own agenda, whatever that is.
Clearly, this wasn't going to stop. This was a psychopath playing cat and mouse with law enforcement.
Over the next 4 days, the snipers killed 2 more people. Both attacks, Dean Myers and Kenneth Bridges, take place at gas stations in Virginia.
We're seeing a pattern. They're hitting at gas stations, parking lots, schools, very public.
People were being much more cautious. I saw people ducking down behind their cars as they're actually filling their gas tanks.
But that doesn't stop the snipers. On October 14th, 47-year-old FBI analyst Linda Franklin is shot in the parking lot of a Home Depot.
That was the first time that a member of law enforcement had been targeted, but I believe that he was unaware that Linda Franklin worked for the FBI.
We're supposed to protect the herd. These were easy targets. They weren't going to be able to put up any struggle, any fight.
On October 19th, 37-year-old Jeffrey Hopper is shot in Ashland, Virginia, about 90 miles south of Washington, D.C.
He and his wife were traveling from north of D.C. down to Georgia, and they had made the deliberate decision to wait till they got well south of where these shootings were going on before they would pull over and have some dinner. They pulled over down outside of Richmond and went into a Ponderosa to have their meal. As they left the restaurant, a shot rang out.
Thankfully, Hopper is not killed. When investigators search the area, they find another shell casing and another message from the snipers.
Go in the woods, sure enough, find the casing. We also find a note in a plastic bag.
If y'all want us to stop, give us $10 million, we'll go away.
And they want it put on a ATM card. So that also tells you they're not real bright.
But I think most chilling from the note this time, it said, P.S. Your children are not safe anywhere, anytime.
However, this time the serial killers have given investigators a clue they can follow up on.
It took all of 30 seconds for us to discover that this ATM card had been stolen from a bus driver in Texas several weeks before. So that starts the FBI on a trail. Now we can start tracking. Also, in the letter, they mentioned that they'd tried to call and confess, but they were being ignored. So therefore, some of these killings and shootings were our fault because of our incompetence.
Sure enough, investigators find a call to one of the tip lines made 2 days before.
He said, you need to look at the shootings in Montgomery, Alabama. There were 2 women that were shot, and that was us.
The D.C. sniper attacks were unique in many ways. One of the most significant was the number of law enforcement agencies working together to catch the killers who were terrorizing Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Virginia.
When a terrorist act occurs, the information is originally disseminated by the FBI, then to other intelligence organizations. The advancement of technology and the response of law enforcement has improved. These days, you go on a crime spree. Because of cell phones and surveillance cameras everywhere, you're not getting away with it long.
The DMV area is now in the 3rd week of an ongoing manhunt for the snipers terrorizing its streets. What began as a random series of shootings has turned into a deadly game of cat and mouse with law enforcement.
Not only do they have the God complex, but they feel invincible. They're to the point now where they're taunting the police.
They even called into the tip line that was set up for any information about the shooters.
The caller, who was at that time unidentified, said, we're the people you're looking for, and if you don't believe us, call Montgomery, Alabama police.
Task force investigators contact Montgomery County Police to verify the information. One crime immediately stands out. 2 women had been shot during a liquor store robbery on September 21st.
Police officers arrived on scene quickly, and they observed a young man over the bodies. He was armed with a small caliber handgun, and he had a firearms catalog. When officers took chase, the suspect dropped what he was carrying and managed to get away. But they recovered this firearms catalog and the handgun. A latent fingerprint was recovered from that catalog. Unfortunately, police in Montgomery, Alabama ran it through a state system and did not get a hit.
This is a time before all the systems were linked. In other words, Maryland had their own system. Alabama had their own system.
But when investigators checked the federal database, they come up with a match.
We got a hit to Bellingham, Washington through an INS immigrations record. We were able to identify a person, Lee Boyd Malvo, from that fingerprint.
Lee Malvo was a young Jamaican that had been snuck into the country and had been deported at least once. He's traced to being in contact with this guy by the name of John Muhammad. So now we have two names.
Muhammad was born John Allen Williams in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. After high school, he served in the Louisiana National Guard. Then in 1997, he converted to Islam, changed his name to Muhammad, and joined the Army, where he worked as an engineer. But his true skill was with a rifle.
Muhammad had earned the Expert Rifleman's Badge on the M16. That's the Army's highest of 3 levels of basic marksmanship.
Muhammad and his wife Mildred raised 3 children in Washington State before he was deployed to Iraq during Operation Desert Storm. When he returned, he was a different man.
It would come out later that he was diagnosed with PTSD and was prone to fits of rage. It eventually led to his wife filing for divorce in 1999.
They ended up in a very nasty, contested divorce and custody battle out on the West Coast. At one point, when Muhammad had a visitation, he left the country with the kids. Muhammad made trips on occasion to Antigua, and that's where he met a young man, Lee Boyd Malvo.
This kid who was sort of a juvenile runaway, lost soul from Jamaica and taken him under his wing.
Muhammad eventually brought Malvo back to the U.S. with him, and they came in on the West Coast.
Upon his return to Washington State, Muhammad enrolled his children in school, which immediately set off alarms.
These children had been reported abducted. The authorities came in and took the kids out of school and took them back to Mildred and put them in Mildred's custody.
Afraid it would happen again, Mildred moved with her children to an undisclosed location in Maryland in October of 2001.
That makes Malvo the only family Muhammad really has left. As kind of a father-son thing, he decides he's going to teach Malvo how to shoot. But first, they need a gun. So they go into a store and steal a Bushmaster rifle.
Muhammad took Malvo to the home of his Army friend, Robert Holmes. And when they were at Robert Holmes' house, they did a lot of shooting. Muhammad taught Malvo how to zero in a sight on the Bushmaster. They did a lot of target practicing, shooting into a stump.
Holmes tells investigators that Malvo got so proficient with the rifle that he earned himself a nickname, Sniper.
We sent a couple of guys out to remove the entire stump.
They end up digging up some bullets that match the bullets that they have from the victims of the sniper shootings.
So now this search is on for John Muhammad and Lee Malvo. We did a nationwide name search through all available databases for registered vehicles.
John Allen Muhammad's name comes up. It turns out he's registered a vehicle, a blue Caprice, that he recently purchased and registered to an address in New Jersey.
We're focused on white vans. And we had already unknowingly given ourselves tunnel vision.
On October 23rd, 2001, A bolo with the sniper's descriptions and the plate number of the car are given to every law enforcement agency and media outlet in the country.
We saw these pictures and we realized, no, these aren't white guys. These are black men. And I remember everybody talking about, wow, talk about breaking a glass ceiling. Because now you have black people actually doing it as serial killers.
The next morning, the car is spotted 50 miles north of D.C. Maryland state troopers are the first to arrive. After 3 weeks of evading police, the snipers are now the ones in the crosshairs.
We had a trooper blocking the entrance to the rest area. Another canine trooper had pulled up. We didn't know where the snipers were. But if we had to, the three of us would just bum rush that car and take them down.
In the early morning hours of October 24th, 2002, investigators have finally caught up with the snipers who have been terrorizing the D.C. area for weeks. A multi-jurisdictional task force storms the rest stop where Leeboy Malvo and John Muhammad are hiding.
John Allen Muhammad and Leeboy Malvo were asleep in the car.
We're able to quietly sneak in, and it was textbook. They were taken down without firing a shot. Yeah, I think they were probably both very disappointed that they didn't go down in a blaze of glory. I will take that to my grave. I believe that that's what they were hoping to do. And if there's any satisfaction at all, we were at least able to deprive them of that.
When investigators searched the Blue Caprice, they discovered the pair had been using it as a mobile sniper's nest.
There was a notch in the back of the trunk from where shots had been taken. There was ammunition. There were even voice recorders in that vehicle where they had been practicing their extortion demands.
Yeah, I believe it was either an FBI or an ATF lab guy pulls that Bushmaster rifle out from underneath the back seat. It makes it safe by pulling back the receiver. And I can never forget this. I visibly saw the little brass bullet and cartridge do its little circle in the air as it come down and tinkled on the pavement. And I knew at that point, we got him. This nightmare is over.
At first, both men remained silent about their crimes. But after a few weeks in police custody, Lee Malvo confesses.
He said Muhammad was using the scope, which we recovered in the car, and he was watching for police. He was looking at viable targets. He was honing in on the target, and then Malvo would set up and actually take the shot.
As Muhammad's trial approaches, prosecutors discover a potential motive.
This is a man with PTSD and anger issues, and his wife was divorcing him and was taking the children away. So these could have been triggers that led him to commit these crimes.
Muhammad told Robert Holmes, "I'm going to find Mildred."
She had disappeared, as it turned out, into Maryland with the children, and he wanted to find and get his children.
Investigators believe he found out where Mildred was from her friend.
Muhammad said, "I just found out where Mildred is. She's back east in Maryland somewhere, so we're leaving to go there."
But before they left, Lee Malvo gunned down the friend's 21-year-old niece, Kenya Cook, on February 16th. She is believed to be his first victim. The pair then headed east towards Maryland.
As they're coming across country, they're pulling these robberies. They've got the Bushmaster. They pulled the robbery in a couple of places.
Between February and September of 2002, 7 people were killed and 7 others wounded before the shooting spree in the DMV area even began.
He never did kill his wife, which makes this whole thing even more bizarre because Muhammad wanted to make his wife look like she was the victim of a serial killer.
Motives are strange, as I think is frequently the case when you have people who are serial killers.
In October of 2003, John Allen Muhammad stands trial in Virginia.
I attended the trial, and I can remember looking him in the eyes, and he was just, the look that he gave me was, he was just as if he didn't finish the job. He just looked like he was upset that I was still alive.
The prosecution calls more than 130 witnesses and introduces more than 400 pieces of evidence. But the defense insists there is no proof Muhammad shot anyone.
It was Malvo's DNA, it was Malvo's fingerprints.
Malvo is the one that confessed, and not Muhammad.
But it turns out Muhammad did leave evidence at one of the crime scenes, the shooting of 13-year-old Iron Brown.
He was the one that wrote the note on the tarot card, and his DNA was on the pen.
It was critical in this case because it was the only DNA from Muhammad from any crime scene, from anything in the case.
On November 17th, 2003, Muhammad is found guilty and later sentenced to death. Meanwhile, Lee Malvo's trial is just getting started in nearby Chesapeake, Virginia.
The biggest obstacle in that case was, I think, Malvo's youth.
The defense team presented him as a child.
Despite his confession, Malvo pleads not guilty, claiming he was under Muhammad's control. The jury doesn't agree. On December 18th, 2003, they find Malvo guilty. He is sentenced to life in prison.
I understand the fact that he was 17 years old, but I believe he knew what he was doing.
That 17-year-old was a psychopath. You could see it in his face and in his eyes, and that was his motivation. He was a psychopath that John Muhammad was able to utilize for his means.
Two of the most notorious serial killers in the nation's history had finally been stopped. But the terrifying 3-week shooting spree would leave its mark on the DMV for decades to come.
I think the things that occurred in the early 2000s, the 9/11 attacks, the anthrax scare, the sniper killings, really made us a little more cynical. We're all aware of, on any given day, anything dramatic and bad and awful can happen.
In spite of tragedies, in spite of hardships, in spite of these hard times, DC is resilient. DC bounces back, DC fights back, and it remains the strong nation's capital that it is and always was.